The women's rights movement. In the 1800s, women in the United States and many places around the world weren't allowed to vote and didn't have the same rights as white men. Black men were given the right to vote, or suffrage, in 1870, but still women weren't allowed to vote. Some people didn't think that this was right. One of these people, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, became one of the first leaders of the women's suffrage movement. Even though she was a wife and mother, Elizabeth devoted much of her life to the women's suffrage cause. In 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her friend Lucretia Mott organized the Seneca Falls Convention in upstate New York. Here, hundreds of women gathered to discuss issues facing women, including suffrage. Frederick Douglass, a famous African-American rights activist, was one of the few men and the only African-American person at this convention. He stated that he would not accept his newly given right to vote if women weren't given that same right as well. 2 years later, Lucy Stone, another leader of the women's suffrage movement, organized the National Women's Rights Convention. In Worcester, Massachusetts, 900 people, who were primarily men, met and spoke about women's suffrage and other topics, such as the abolition of slavery. Susan B. Anthony, one of the most famous leaders of the suffrage movement, was actually at this convention. In fact, this convention was what inspired her to devote the rest of her life to the cause of women's suffrage. She and Elizabeth Cady Stanton became good friends and created a women's suffrage association, whose mission was to obtain various rights for women, including the right to vote. The first states to pass women's suffrage were mostly in the newly settled West. Wyoming and Utah were the first states to pass women's suffrage in 1870. Even though some states were passing laws that allowed women to vote, the federal government did not. There were many protests in Washington, D.C. demanding that President Woodrow Wilson and Congress pass a law that would give women this right to vote. Little progress was made until World War I. President Wilson declared World War I a war for democracy, and this made many women angry. How could our country really be a democracy if women weren't given the right to vote? Finally, President Wilson listened to the demands. In 1920, the 19th Amendment was passed and women were granted the right to vote.